Sometimes you say something on the radio and then the fallout from it pretty much backs up exactly what you said. I'm referencing a point I made coming out of 9 o'clock news yesterday when I was talking about healthcare and how so many people now believe it's a right. And so many people feel that the government should be taking care of them from cradle to grave. And I said that this is an outgrowth of the baby boom generation, and they're afraid of dying. They're trying to postpone death. Now, I didn't take any flack on air about it, but when I went back to my desk after the show, I had a few phone messages from people calling me up angry. Well, I'm a baby boomer and I've had a really tough life. How dare you? And I got emails about it too, as well. All right, you had a tough life. I don't know your life. Maybe you grew up in an abusive home, but here's something to keep in mind. If you were growing up in an abusive home in 1955, were you better off than someone growing up in an abusive home in 1855 or 1755? Did you have a better life than the people who grew up during the Depression and then went off and fought the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II? They came home and they didn't have a lot of expectations. They just sat down, started going to work. They were the parents, generally, of the baby boomers. I throw this all out there because my reference was really saying a lot of these baby boomers are whiners, and then sure enough, they go prove me right immediately after the show. What's up with you people, and how literal do you take this? Am I supposed to sit here and say, baby boomers are a bunch of whiners, they're lazy, and they think they're going to live forever, with the exception of these three? Maybe that would make you feel better. It's not like I singled you out and said, Jimmy Jones, who lives on 3600 Road, is a layabout. And I want you to know that. Jimmy, I'm talking to you right now. I mean, I don't know you, but I'm sitting here pointing out your direction on the radio as I speak. Maybe it's the lack of critical thinking skills that they didn't get in school as the baby boom generation. They can't figure it out. Because apparently you can't even just make a general statement any longer without these people having a cow over it. Good grief, people, get lives. And I sit here every day and I talk about how liberals are the biggest whiners I ever met. And then you turn around and you get these conservatives, so-called conservatives, who say to you, I'm deeply offended. I thought that was only a liberal disease. 9 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I know a couple of things. Before the baby boom generation came along, this country didn't have a drug epidemic, and it's had one now for 50, 60 years. Before the baby boom generation came along, this country didn't have a divorce epidemic, and it has had one now for decades. Previous generations simply endured, and they showed some responsibility, and they did those things. And this notion that, well, I had a tough life. Relative to what? I had friends who had tough lives growing up, too, as well, and some of them, like me, were of the baby boom generation. But relative to what? Some guy starving in Africa? I know there are people who endure horrible things. They always have. When I was a kid growing up, I was sharing a story in our little pregame warm-up, our Facebook video, before I actually went on air here at 8:06 this morning. When I was a little boy, I remember I'd have to work alongside my dad after school and on weekends. And I can remember sometimes hearing the shouts, the gleeful shouts of kids down the street, down the road, who were out playing ball, and I wanted to be playing ball with them. But I'm not horribly scarred by that. I like spending time with my dad, and I learned a lot of neat things from him while I was working alongside him. Maybe I'm not the best carpenter in the world. Maybe I'm not the best auto mechanic in the world. But you know what? I learned a lot of things about life, just things he would share with me about his own experiences. There are things I wish had turned out differently in life, but you take what comes. Telephone number for reaching our program today, 736-0300, 736-0300. Years ago, I mentioned on the radio that we had a problem with certain kids in our schools, and people started calling me up saying, I don't know what you're talking about, Bill. My child is an honor student. Well, put a bumper sticker on your car and leave me alone, okay? I wasn't sitting here saying Jimmy Jones and his children are a bunch of dummies. I'm not singling anybody personally out. You got that? Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. Hey, these snowflakes, I think they had a hard life. They had to look at my life. I had shredded carrots put in the bottom of my Jell-O growing up. But really, if they want to have socialized health care, let them move up north. Quit paying these high premiums and take that money and pack their belongings and get out. Just like Representative Labrador is getting so much flack for, the saying that he said nobody ever died from not having health care.
Yes,
There's
in this
two
day and age,
guarantees in life.
you can't tell the truth anymore without somebody jumping all over you and screaming that you need to be silenced.
Exactly. There's two guarantees in life, Bill. We all die, and we're all going to pay taxes if we live in America. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you much for the call. Yeah, you tell the truth any longer, but it might hurt somebody's feelings, so we have to shut that up. The Orwellian nature of modern America, and it just seems to be spinning more and more out of control. Good time for me to reference a book that I happen to be reading. I bought this book. I was looking for another book that I wanted to pick up about what's currently going on in France. This was a couple of weeks ago, and I'd heard about this book that was highly recommended. In fact, I mentioned it on air last week. But I came across this book. I ended up buying three. It's like one of those stories you go to the grocery store because you need a gallon of milk, and then you come out with a cart filled with $70 worth of groceries. Same thing when I'm buying books. I bought this book, and it's called Earning the Rockies. And the writer is Robert D. Kaplan. He wrote a book back in the 1990s that people poo-pooed at the time. He called it in 1994, so we're going back nearly a quarter century. He wrote a book at the end of the Cold War, and it was called The Coming Anarchy. And he said, no, this is not a triumphal moment around the world that the Cold War has ended. He said, we're going to see nations break apart. We're going to see people resume to some sort of tribalism. There will be wars between various religious factions. And everyone said he was wrong. And of course, he was spot on. He's written a new book called Earning the Rockies. And he's written several books about geography and how geography plays a role in the histories and even in the futures of some countries. But Earning the Rockies is a name that comes, he's a baby boom guy, I should point out. When he was a little boy growing up, his parents would take him on a lot of trips to see historic sites. His dad was a truck driver, and his dad had seen a lot of the country, but they never got beyond the Mississippi. So some 25 years ago, when he was a young man, he hitchhiked across the country. Then 25 years ago, he decided to go across the country, and he was doing interviews with various people that he would meet in various places, diners and the like, and taverns. And he said that they would tell him, and he said, this is what he learned. He said, they'll tell you what you want to hear because, well, it's just like the network reporters who parachute into Nebraska during an election year and say, this is what the people believe at Jimmy's Diner. And the guy eating his eggs and bacon, he just wants you to leave him alone so he answers your question and hopes that you get it done quickly so he can still have hot food. So this time around, Mr. Kaplan decided to drive west. And instead of asking people questions and identifying himself as the author, he quietly goes into a hotel, he quietly goes into diners and taverns, and he sits at a booth and he just listens to the conversation around him. And he was explaining, he said, it's amazing what people talk about. And he said, middle America, unlike the coastal elites, middle America doesn't sit around obsessing about what happens in places like Washington. Middle America still has some very traditional values. He said people make fun of them because they may not be the handsomest people. They don't wear the latest new styles. Obesity epidemic is high. But he said they're the nicest people. They'll talk openly about God. They'll talk about their families. They'll talk about their favorite TV shows, the baseball game last night. And he said, they're really not too wrapped up in a lot of what happens in government. He said they have the old Scot-Irish ethic. And really, this is a Scot-Irish country. If you think about it, the people who actually settled Appalachia were all of the Ulster plantationers who ended up being forced off that land so some rich, wealthy Englishman could take it over and graze sheep there. So they came over and they settled in the Appalachian Mountains in the 1700s. Jacksonians. Andrew Jackson's family was among those same people. These are the people who spread west in this country, and they came out across the prairie and settled the mountain ranges in the west. And tremendous, what you'd call loyalty that they have to God, to other various causes, to family, to a flag. But he said, they're of the opinion, you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. On the other hand, if you mess with me, I'll track you down and kill you. And he says that seems to be the American character, and I think it's wonderfully well said. But he points out that when they came west, they had hardships like none of us today can ever imagine. And yet they did it cheerily. They came along and they did. There was no welfare. There were no food stamps. Nobody had health insurance. And yet they came and they built this massive empire west of the Mississippi. The title, Earning the Rockies, his parents gave him a series of travel stories from the Reader's Digest magazine when he was a little boy. And he's not sure, but he thinks that there was a story where a father tells his son that you have to earn the Rockies when they're traveling west, whatever that would mean. But he thought it would be a good title for the book. And so I picked up a copy of the book and I decided to start reading it yesterday. Because as he points out, people in the middle part of the country aren't really wrapped up. The network television news guys all last night were hyperventilating about Sally Yates' testimony in front of U.S. senators yesterday. And, she warned them about Michael Flynn. Well, she also admitted, and they're omitting this, she also admitted at some point that the people she warned may have been a little late in telling the president. So the president eventually asked for Flynn's resignation, but only after someone finally came to him and said, we got a problem here. So there's nothing to see here. There's no smoke. There's no fire. And yet network news was screaming and yelling about this last night. Do you think the guy, if you go over to Depot Grill this morning and sit down, do you think people are sitting there saying, well, I guess the Michael Flynn situation reflects poorly on Donald Trump and his administration. Therefore, come 2022 or 2020, I guess, our next presidential election, I'll have to vote for the liberal Democrat in order to send Donald Trump. They're not thinking about that. They're thinking about, hey, we may be able to use more of the land here because we've got a president. That's the only part of the politics they're thinking of. How it relates to them in their daily lives and struggle here in the Midlands, the midsection of the country between the two coasts. And I have to admit, the book is not long. It's only 186 pages. I've got about 90 pages knocked off already because you know what I did? While I had the TV on and they were droning on at the Senate hearing yesterday, I was reading the book. So I may have caught a few pieces of Sally Yates' testimony. The part where Ted Cruz was grilling her was exceptionally wonderful. But I was reading the book and I was wholly engrossed in this story about what this man is talking about. And it really is a wonderful, wonderful book. And it's very optimistic because he says our way of life and our character that was shaped by this part of the country, he said other countries that rival us economically right now don't have that to sustain them in the long run. Got about 30 seconds before the break. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And I wanted to tell you about an event coming up. We tell you frequently on the program about our friend Dr. Christine Pickup, a doctor of audiology at Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert. She'd like to invite the public to a seminar and lunch to be held at the Minnetonka Chamber of Commerce in Heyburn, May 18th at noon. She'll be sharing details on hearing health, brain health, and current technology advances. If you'd like to attend, she'd ask you to RSVP. And her telephone number, 208-312-0957. That's 312-0957. Wanted to mention we're also going to be talking with Steve Millington this morning. He's the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. He joins us most Tuesday mornings, spends a few minutes with us. We're at 48 on our way into, about the 70-degree range, I guess, today, and even warmer tomorrow. And then things, just like they've been going, the cycle continues. Cold and nasty this weekend.